Good afternoon. The Secretary General will brief you on today's deliberations by foreign ministers, and then he'll have time for a few questions. Secretary General.
Good afternoon. We have just concluded a meeting of NATO foreign ministers. In our first session, we were joined by Georgia and Ukraine. We discussed the security situation in the region. Russia's continued aggressive and destabilizing actions against its neighbors and its military build-up in and around Ukraine. We need to remain vigilant and avoid escalation. Ministers made clear any future Russian aggression would come at a high price and have serious political and economic consequences for Russia. Georgia and Ukraine are long-standing and close NATO partners, contributing to our missions and operations and aspiring for membership. Ministers made clear that we stand by our decisions. Our support for their sovereignty and territorial integrity remains unwavering, and we remain committed to enhance our support to both countries. We are already strengthening their capabilities to defend themselves, training and exercising together, providing maritime support and sharing information. We also addressed the importance of moving ahead with reforms to strengthen the rule of law and democracy, fight corruption, and continue to transform the security and defense sectors. These reforms are key to make both Georgia and Ukraine stronger and more resilient. Our second session focused on Afghanistan and the lessons learned from NATO's engagement there over almost 2 decades. Ministers had an in-depth discussion on these lessons and how we can improve the way NATO plans and conducts future crisis management operations, both at the political and military levels. NATO's mission in Afghanistan was not in vain. For over 20 years, there have been no terrorist attacks on our countries organized from Afghanistan. Only NATO had the capacity and the political will to conduct this massive and complex crisis management operation. And it is clear that the crisis management must remain a core task for NATO. At the same time, we must recognize that the international community, including NATO, the UN and the EU and other actors, raised the level of ambition to nation building. That broader task proved much more difficult. So we must ensure that our levels of ambition remain realistic. Despite the brave service of many Afghan soldiers and years of international support, they were hampered by corruption, poor leadership, and inability to sustain their own forces. For the future, we must ensure that NATO training efforts create more self-sustaining forces. Ministers also agreed that we would have benefited from more meaningful discussions on the negotiations of the US-Taliban agreement concluded in February last year. At the same time, the consultations this year on the future of our mission were open and sincere. And based on these consultations, we decided together to end NATO's mission in Afghanistan. The Kabul airlift in August demonstrated our capability to support a massive evacuation operation. NATO provided critical functions to ensure the operation of Kabul airport and led coordination of the evacuation effort on the ground. The United States, the United Kingdom, Turkey and Norway provided security and operated the airport under extremely challenging circumstances. For the future, we should explore how to strengthen NATO's ability to conduct short-notice, large-scale, non-combatant evacuation efforts, either through NATO's response force or as a standalone force. These lessons we have learned from Afghanistan will shape NATO's crisis management role in the future. And as we look back at the lessons from Afghanistan, we must maintain our efforts to fight terrorism and build the capacity of our partners, including through the critical work of our training mission in Iraq. For our final session, we were joined by our partners Finland, Sweden, and by the EU High Representative Borrell. We discussed stability and security in the Western Balkans. The region has come a long way since the conflicts of the 1990s, but recently we have seen tensions rise, including in Kosovo as well as Bosnia and Herzegovina. With more aggressive rhetoric, stalled reforms, and foreign actors working to undermine progress. NATO will continue to promote stability, security, and cooperation in the region, and we agreed on the importance of our presence, including our KFOR mission in Kosovo and our offices in Sarajevo and in Belgrade. Our cooperation with the European Union remains essential, and we will continue to work together to preserve stability and support reforms. I want to end by thanking our Latvian colleagues for their excellent work in hosting this meeting of NATO foreign ministers. This shows once again Latvia's strong commitment to our alliance. And with that, I'm ready to take your questions.
Okay, we'll start with NBC, second row. Second row here, thanks.
Thank you so much, Mr. Secretary General. Andrea Mitchell, NBC News. I wanted to ask you about the serious consequences to Russia, given that Ukraine, if they are threatened with an invasion, is obviously not a NATO member. So what more could NATO do? What would be the economic and political consequences? And on Afghanistan, is it your view that given the humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan, that NATO members such as the US should consider other means of getting money without going through the Taliban? What more can be done given the $7 billion that's frozen, of assets frozen by the US and other assets to get to the crying need of the starving people of Afghanistan? Thank you, sir.
The return of Taliban in Afghanistan is a tragedy for the Afghan people. And we also see that they now face a very, very severe humanitarian situation with the coming winter and risk for serious humanitarian consequences of the economic crisis in Afghanistan. NATO has ended its military presence in Afghanistan, but NATO allies continue to provide humanitarian support through different UN institutions to humanitarian organizations. And I welcome that because we need to continue to provide support to the people of Afghanistan. And that was also addressed during the meeting today, the need to provide humanitarian support through different international institutions and the UN. Then on Ukraine, so we have a wide range of options to make sure that Russia will be confronted with serious consequences if they once again use force against an independent sovereign nation, Ukraine. Everything from economic sanctions, financial sanctions, political restrictions, but also, as we saw after 2014 when they illegally annexed Crimea and continued to destabilize eastern Ukraine, support the separatists in Donbass. That actually triggered the biggest reinforcement of our collective defense since the end of the Cold War, with the deployment of battle groups in the Baltic region and Poland, combat-ready NATO troops for the first time in NATO's history, and also increased presence in the Black Sea, and also increased air policing and other military activities that demonstrates NATO's resolve to protect and defend all allies, especially in the eastern part of the alliance, the Black Sea region and the Baltic region. We provide support to Ukraine with capacity building. Allies provide training, equipment, and advice, and we also share information with them, and we monitor very closely what is going on the borders of Ukraine. But of course, there's a difference between a close and highly valued partner, Ukraine, where we provide support, and NATO allies, where we actually have our collective defense clause, where we provide security guarantees enshrined in the Washington Treaty for all NATO allies. So we will continue to use NATO as a platform to consult, to coordinate, also on potential economic sanctions and other measures. Even though NATO is not making those decisions, NATO is the platform that brings together North America, European allies, EU and others to discuss also economic sanctions. And then, of course, NATO make decisions on everything related to the security guarantees for our NATO allied countries.
We'll go to ZDF.
Florian Neuhan, ZDF German TV. Mr. Stoltenberg, this morning the Ukrainian Minister for Foreign Affairs told us that membership of his country in NATO was inevitable. I'd like to know whether you agree with this assessment, and do you think this would also be a signal of de-escalation if NATO expands towards the Russian spheres of influence?
You know, just the question is reflecting something which I think we should be very, very much aware of, that is not acceptable. And that is that Russia has a sphere of influence. They try to re-establish some kind of acceptance that Russia has a right to control what neighbors do or not do. And that's the kind of world we don't want to return to, where big powers had a say or a kind of right to put limitations of what sovereign independent nations can do. I'm coming from a small country bordering Russia, and I'm very glad that our NATO allies have never respected that Russia has a kind of right to establish a sphere of influence in the north, trying to decide what Norway as a small independent country can do or not do. And that's exactly the same for Ukraine. Ukraine is an independent sovereign nation with international recognized borders guaranteed by Russia and all the other powers. And those borders, those international recognized borders, should be respected. And that includes, of course, Crimea as part of Ukraine and Donbas as part of Ukraine. So this idea that NATO support to a sovereign nation is a provocation is just wrong. It's to respect the sovereignty of the will of the Ukrainian people. So I think that tells more about Russia than about NATO. NATO is a defensive alliance. NATO is not a threat to anyone, but NATO respects the decision of countries like the Baltic countries, Poland, when they decided to join, and we also respect the decision of Ukraine that they aspire for NATO membership. We have stated that they will become a member, but of course it's up to us, 30 NATO allies, to decide when Ukraine is ready for membership, when they meet the NATO standards. We help them on their way towards membership with reforms, with support, with fighting corruption, with building defense and security institutions. And the message is that it's only Ukraine and 30 NATO allies that decides when Ukraine is ready to join NATO. Russia has no veto, Russia has no say, and Russia has no right to establish a sphere of influence trying to control their neighbors.
Okay, Al Jazeera Balkans, first row.
What we see in Bosnia is not only separatistic rhetoric, as we can hear from international diplomats. They are concrete acts which undermine the state institutions. While we listen how worried NATO, EU, and US are, Milorad Dodik is in Russia asking Putin for more support for his acts. What we understand is that if NATO is not coming to Bosnia, we will have Russian forces there. Russian media already are talking about that option. I would like to ask you if NATO will allow that.
NATO strongly supports the integrity of Bosnia and Herzegovina. NATO has this history there. We went into Bosnia in the 1990s and ended the brutal ethnic war there. And since then, NATO has been in Bosnia, closely working together with the European Union. And we actually discussed that with our Western European partners today, Sweden and Finland, and the High Representative Josep Borrell, the importance of NATO and the EU continuing to work closely together in Bosnia and Herzegovina. We are, of course, concerned about the very aggressive rhetoric from Mr. Dodik, and his inflammatory rhetoric is just undermining the Dayton Agreement and the efforts to build a stable multi-ethnic Bosnia and Herzegovina. NATO will continue to provide support with capacity building, with implementing reforms, and one of the few multi-ethnic institutions in Bosnia and Herzegovina is the armed forces. And that's a success story of NATO, because we have really helped to build, train that as a multi-ethnic institution, and anything that can undermine that, of course, we will do whatever we can to prevent that from happening, because we need multi-ethnic institutions, state institutions, including the armed forces. So we will be focused and continue to work with Bosnia and Herzegovina.
I'll take one question online from Associated Press, Lorne Cook.
Secretary General, I hope you can hear me well. Lorne Cook from Associated Press. On Afghanistan and the report that you've been looking at with the ministers, would you agree that taxpayers and voters and Afghans themselves should actually see what lessons you've learned? There must be more to it than what you've said today. And can you guarantee that this report is not going to be watered down, or that it's going to disappear like some of the field commanders' reports did in Afghanistan? And just more broadly, doesn't NATO need profound reform? You seem to suggest that it's been a victim of mission creep, dragged by the international community. And how's it useful that one member country makes most of the decisions, and really big ones like the troop surge, when it's time to leave, who can take part in talks with the Taliban, and then others follow and then they complain about it later? Don't you think you need a more robust debate in the North Atlantic Council?
First of all, we had a very good discussion today, and we had many open and sincere discussions over the last weeks and months in NATO about the lessons learned from Afghanistan. Because I think it's extremely important that after 20 years, ending in a mission like we did in Afghanistan, there is an absolute need for an honest and thorough lessons learned process, and that's exactly what we have conducted, including by inviting external experts, by inviting all allies to share their experiences, and there have been different experiences and different views, and that's part of a lessons learned process, to have this open and sincere discussion within the alliance. We will publish the main conclusions, the main findings, and then I think we also understand that just the process in itself has been important, because we actually use time also with external experts to try to understand both what went well, and what we achieved, and where we didn't achieve our goals. And as I said, we have to remember that the main task, the main reason we went into Afghanistan was to fight international terrorism. And on that we actually achieved a lot. We were able to degrade Al-Qaeda and other terrorist organizations. Since 9/11, we have prevented any terrorist attack organized from Afghanistan against our countries, which was the main purpose of going in. And we have prevented Afghanistan from being a safe haven for international terrorist organizations, and our aim is to preserve those gains. Then, gradually, and we all have a responsibility for that, NATO, individual allies, my own country, Norway, the UN, EU, and the whole international community, we have a responsibility that gradually we had mission creep. Because gradually the aim of the whole mission evolved from fighting terrorism, preventing Afghanistan being a safe haven for international terrorists, to nation building. And I understand that, because that's also a very important task, but much more difficult. and requires much more forces and resources over a long period of time. And there, of course, even though we have made some gains that are not easily reversed, like for instance educating millions of people, not least women, the return of Taliban was of course a collapse of the efforts of having a democratic, stable Afghanistan based on human rights. So yes, there are some lessons learned where we can actually say we achieved a lot, and then there are some lessons where we didn't achieve the goals, and one of them was connected to that there was a gradual mission creep. Another lesson is that we need to make sure that when we train and build local capacity, that we enable those forces to be self-sustained and not totally depend on us. So when we leave, they can actually be able to sustain their own efforts and the presence, and that will be something that will be also a lesson learned for any future crisis management operation by NATO, because another lesson learned is that, of course, NATO has to be ready once again to conduct big operations fighting international terrorism, as NATO allies and NATO did in the fight against ISIS in Iraq and Syria. And we cannot rule out that that will also be a need for this kind of military presence also in the future.
Okay, we'll take one very last and very quick question online from Laylu Masadid from Brussels Morning.
Thank you very much, Juana. Laylu Masadid from Brussels Morning. Secretary General, you said in 20 years there is no threat from Afghanistan. Who can make guarantee any attack will not organize for the future, because the Taliban couldn't cut their ties with Al-Qaeda and also with Haqqani network? And second, there are daily reports about the killings of the Afghan ANDS members at the hand of the Taliban. So you had provided enduring support for them. Hasn't it NATO failed on that? And thank you very much.
So NATO will continue to hold the Taliban regime accountable for what they have promised, including on human rights, on safe passage, and we continue to get people out of Afghanistan. And of course we continue also to communicate very clearly that we expect them to respect what they have promised, and I think we also need to understand that we also have NATO allies also imposed sanctions, and this is a way to make sure that they live up to their commitments, including on human rights. But there is no doubt that the return of Taliban was a serious setback, and it was heartbreaking for all of us who have supported Afghanistan for decades, and it's a tragedy for the Afghan people. But my message was that the core, the main reason for NATO going in was to fight international terrorism, and that gain, the aim is actually to preserve, partly by holding Taliban accountable, partly by also being ready to strike from distance over the horizon if needed, and NATO allies have those capabilities if needed. So we will continue to work hard to prevent Afghanistan once again being a safe haven, a platform where terrorist organizations can plan, organize, train, finance big terrorist attacks against our own countries.
Thank you very much. This concludes this press conference. Thank you.
Thank you so much.